Thank you very much, Tim, for that gracious and lively introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a genuine pleasure to be in Iowa once again, and particularly to be at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, where for many years I was a kind of de facto resident scholar. And I live now in Massachusetts, and during the time that I lived in Iowa, I often went back to Massachusetts for family reasons, and that became known as East Branch, hence the allusion in Tim's introduction. But it's good to be in West Branch again. I don't know whether this audience would necessarily realize it, but this library has a national reputation for being user-friendly. And I want to compliment Tim and all of his colleagues, past and present, who certainly made my life more agreeable, enjoyable, and rewarding during the times that I have been at this library. And I continue to work on some Hoover-related projects, so I continue by email to ask for their assistance. So archivists are the unsung heroes of scholarship, of historical scholarship, and deserve, I think, a special mention today. It is, as Tim has mentioned, a day of celebration as we mark the appearance of the 4th volume in the biography series. Herbert Hoover was one of the few Americans who truly deserves a multi-volume biography, and in volume 4, Professor Kendrick Clements helps us understand why. He has written a discerning and necessary and excellent book, and Ken, I congratulate you on that fine achievement, and I commend his book to all of you. It is also, as Tim has mentioned, a day of remembrance of Gary Best, whom I got to know rather well over many years with our mutual interests in Herbert Hoover. And I, for one, will miss the insight and humor with which he would have favored us today were he here. Some years ago, in fact, it was on November 3rd, 1988 to be exact, when Volume 2 of the biography project appeared, I was in Washington to help launch the book with a lecture and reception appearance at the National Archives. I took a taxi cab over from my hotel to the archives, and the taxi driver was rather inquisitive, wanted to know what I was doing in Washington and so on, and I said, well, I've just written a book. I'm a biographer of President Herbert Hoover. I thought that would rather end the conversation. Instead, he said, Hoover, he was our last real president. All the rest have been playboys. I venture to say to you that that cab driver may have had more insight into Herbert Hoover's seriousness and significance than most people living today. If you go online to the blogosphere or go to the talk shows or cable TV, wherever out there the chattering classes gather to chatter, you will find basically one factoid, or so it is alleged, about Mr. Hoover. And that is that he either caused or greatly exacerbated the Great Depression. 2 factoids will be used, and usually no more than 2, to justify that assertion. It will be pointed out first that as president in 1930, he signed into law something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which the detractors allege was of catastrophic consequence for the American economy. The other factoid will be that in June of 1932, as president, he signed into law legislation passed by Congress raising taxes to very high levels by peacetime standards, the highest in peacetime American history. What will not be mentioned is that the federal deficit at that point was running approximately 60% of the federal budget. And those are about the only 2 things you are apt to find anywhere. In fact, it would be very hard today to find a positive reference to Herbert Hoover anywhere in the media. And this extends even beyond the conventional media. It also extends, in some ways, this perception to the academic classes too. For example, there was a recent poll of historians of presidents, ranking presidents, and Hoover came in, I think, at 34th, near the very bottom, one below William Henry Harrison, who served as president for 1 month. So, I think it is fair to say that Herbert Hoover has become the Rodney Dangerfield of American politics. He gets no respect. He is unwelcome now in liberal, progressive, and conservative pantheons alike. And more than that, he is a man almost nobody knows, a victim of a rising tide of ignorance and amnesia. If Herbert Hoover is looking down upon these proceedings this afternoon, I suspect he is chuckling. Because by the time this project is completed a few years hence, it will have taken 4 historians and biographers nearly as long to write about his public life as it took him to live it. But that, in a certain way, is a tribute to Herbert Hoover's importance in our history. The panelists today have been asked to reflect on the challenges we faced while writing the biography, a comprehensive multi-volume biography of Mr. Hoover. The project began, as you heard a moment ago, in 1975. Really, it had its inception in the Hoover Centennial of 1974, when the trustees of the Library Association realized that for all of the celebration going on, there was no solid biography of Herbert Hoover in existence. Journalistic biographies, yes, pro and con, but nothing that would command enduring attention of teachers and students and scholars. I was therefore invited to fill this gap and to undertake a definitive scholarly biography of Hoover, and I underscore those 2 key words, definitive and scholarly. By definitive, I meant a standard reference work, an authoritative work with an enduring shelf life. In other words, not something quickly written and quickly forgotten. By scholarly, I think we meant something that would be based on archival research, not partisan in its fundamental character, neither pro or anti-Hoover, but striving, perhaps imperfectly, but striving to be objective and dispassionate. So I was asked to write a biography not to defend Hoover on every point, or to praise him, or pity him, or pillory him, but rather to understand him as he understood himself and in the context of his time. The implications of this conceptualization of the project were considerable. First, it meant that there could be no cutting of corners or skipping over certain portions of Hoover's life that might not be of particular interest to the biographer. Secondly, it meant that no arbitrary timetable was possible, no fixed number of words, at least as we were getting into the project early on. Many times today, publishers will come to you and say, we would like you to write a book on such and such a topic. We want it in 3 years. You'll write 75,000 pages and not a word more. No, that was not the way one could really undertake a biography of this man. And I took heart, as I proceeded into this project, from some words of the eminent historian and librarian of Congress, Daniel Boorstin, who in 1981 at a conference made these remarks. He said, "We would not be far off the mark if we characterized a great enterprise as one for which a reliable timetable is impossible. By definition, it is what has never before been accomplished. Only rarely is some great project of intellectual circumnavigation accomplished in a predicted time." So that was the first challenge. This was not to be an ordinary biography. It was to be an act of intellectual circumnavigation, if you will, on a scale that had not been attempted before. The second challenge was that Herbert Hoover was no ordinary man. Consider a few of the salient facts about his career. He was born here in this community in 1874 and was orphaned before he was 10 years old. By the time he was 21, he had worked his way through Stanford University and had entered his chosen profession of mining engineering. At the age of only 24, he was superintendent of a gold mine in the desolate outback of Western Australia. By the age of 27, he had managed a gigantic coal mining enterprise with 9,000 employees in northern China and had survived a harrowing brush with death in the Boxer Rebellion. By 1914, at the age of just 40, Hoover was an extraordinarily successful international mining engineer and financier who had traveled around the world 5 times and had business interests on every continent except Antarctica. Back in the archives here, several years ago, I discovered a little memo that Hoover had compiled trying to figure out how many years of his life he had spent on ships at sea. And it was about 102 weeks, or just about 2 years. With the outbreak of World War I, as we know, Hoover quickly rose to international prominence as the founder and director of the Commission for Relief in Belgium, a humanitarian relief agency that ultimately brought food to more than 9 million French and Belgian civilians every day, an unprecedented undertaking in world history. After serving as head of President Woodrow Wilson's Food Administration, he returned to Europe after the armistice in 1918 for nearly a year as Director General of the American Relief Administration, organizing the supply of food for starving millions, facilitating the emergence of stable economies, and helping thereby to check the advance of Bolshevik revolution across Central Europe. Thanks in considerable measure to the relief efforts of Hoover and his staff, perhaps 1/3 of the population of Europe was saved from privation and perhaps even death. In fact, between 1914 and 1923, it has been estimated that more than 80 million people in more than 20 nations received humanitarian food allotments for which Hoover was at least partly responsible. To put it another way, between 1914 and 1923, Herbert Hoover was responsible for saving more lives than any other person in history. Then came the commerce years, about which we will hear more from Professor Clements, and the presidential years and the post-presidency, which will be discussed in the next panel. During this time of his life, Hoover became not only a man in public life in the usual political sense, but something of a political philosopher and a symbol of what we now frequently today call American exceptionalism. These were strenuous years, to the very end. Even in his mid-80s, he worked between 8 and 12 hours a day. Between the ages of 85 and 90, he published 7 books. A bibliography of his published writings and addresses contains over 1,200 entries. When Herbert Hoover died in 1964, he had lived 90 extraordinarily productive years, including a full 50 in the public eye. It was a record that in sheer duration and scope may be without parallel in American history. The third challenge that I faced, and I think my brethren on these panels would concur, was related to the second. The magnitude of his life was reflected in the magnitude of the documentation available for the study of him. When I arrived out here in Iowa in 1975, there were, I was told, more than 5 million documents in the archives in this building, and that number has grown since. And most of them, not all, but most of them were related one way or another to Herbert Hoover's own life. At the Hoover Institution, which he founded in California at Stanford in 1919, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boxes of the files, of the record files of the relief organizations that he headed, as well as collections of varying size of more than 200 people who worked with him, for him, knew him in some way or another. At the Library of Congress, in the Manuscripts Division, there are over 100 collections of papers of people who had some significant interaction with him. And at the National Archives, as Tim Walsh, I'm sure, can tell you, there are literally miles of government records of agencies, some of which Hoover headed or at least had some contact with. And that's not the whole story. Around the country, and indeed around the world, there are hundreds of manuscript collections that are significantly pertinent to Herbert Hoover's life, including one at Oxford, of all places, Oxford University, which was a key collection that I had to examine, I did in person, regarding Hoover's life in China. And I've spent a month in Australia as well, examining that understudied part of his life when he was a young man there in his 20s. So the sheer volume of documentation in itself forms a challenge, I think, to anyone who would undertake a biography of whatever size of Mr. Hoover. The fourth challenge was that Hoover had an unusual personality and character. Some years ago, a historian from this area wrote a book, his name is Craig Lloyd, entitled Aggressive Introvert. It was a study of Hoover. And I think that that was a very perceptive formulation. To many of his contemporaries, especially in his years in public life, there seemed to be something enigmatic about him. He was laconic. He didn't really enjoy small talk. He was acutely protective of his personal privacy. There was about him, many thought, an aura of impersonal efficiency. And he was not an easy man for even friends and other contemporaries to understand. As an administrator, and he was a formidable administrator, he tended often to rely on intermediaries to achieve his objectives, while he quietly masterminded their efforts from behind the scenes. He was also extraordinarily generous, but he systematically concealed most of his benefactions. He preferred to give anonymously through surrogates, so that even today the full extent of his benevolence is not known. All of these traits, and other traits too, have made it difficult, I think, for historians and biographers to discern his true, often catalytic role in crucial episodes throughout his career. Now, how did I address these challenges? Very briefly, I think the first three tended to fuse together. The structural challenge, that is, the very nature of the project and the standard that I was expected to meet, links up with the magnitude of his life and the quantity of research material available for study of his life, and it all led me rather early to the determination that to do the job right, there would have to be a multi-volume biography. That was not written into the contract when we started, but it was clearly one which I explained to the association, and they agreed, would be the inevitable consequence of doing the biography in the way that they invited me to do. Fortunately, there were models available. This is not the first president to be the subject of a multi-volume biography. Arthur Link, the distinguished Woodrow Wilson biographer, for example, wrote 5 volumes before he turned his immense energies to editing Wilson's papers. Frank Friedel, one of my mentors at Harvard, was an author of a 4-volume biography of Franklin Roosevelt. And both of these individuals whom I mentioned were friends and very supportive of my work. I next made a decision which I think is being followed out now by those who are coming after me as we proceed, and that was to conceive of Hoover's life as a kind of succession of careers. So volume 1 covered his birth and youth, of course, all the way up to 1914 when he turned 40. That was the period of his pre-public life, really, his mining engineering life. Not very much study. Then came the humanitarian phase, the World War and its aftermath, to which I devoted 2 volumes dealing with Hoover as humanitarian and, as he was sometimes called, master of emergencies. Then we have the commerce period, about which we will hear more, and the presidency, and then the very long post-presidency, longer, in fact, than that of any other former president. Although if Jimmy Carter lives about 3 more years, he will establish a new record there. Now, since this is not an academic seminar, I'm not going to tarry over arcane details of research methods, things like that. But I'll offer just a couple observations. First, I learned early on to appreciate the wisdom of Sinclair Lewis's remark that the secret of success is to make the seat of your pants adhere to the seat of your chair for long enough. Herbert Hoover was very good at that too, by the way. Secondly, although from time to time I found it helpful to ask somebody to go out and collect some very specific data for me. For example, I once asked a young assistant, a student I think at the university, to go out and make a copy for me of every article in the New York Times that referred to Herbert Hoover in 1917 and 1918. While from time to time I could ask somebody else to do that kind of very focused data collection, if you will, I early on concluded that while research assistants can collect information, they cannot be expected to evaluate information. That is the biographer's task. And here I recall an influential conversation that I had with Professor Friedel, Frank Friedel, the Roosevelt biographer, early on in my time here. He said that he had never used a research assistant for his volumes on Roosevelt, and he said in words that I've never forgotten, "Only you know what you are looking for." Biography is detective work, and as one proceeds into it, one accumulates knowledge that no other person can be expected to have. So that while someone can go out and copy documents for you, they cannot really interpret the document, because you may see something on the printed page that would not be obvious to someone without the same degree of specialization. Now, as to the fourth challenge, trying to understand Hoover's personality and his true role in events, one thing I learned early on, and I think my brethren would substantiate my conviction here, and that is that there's no substitute really for a universal search, as they say in the computer world, I guess, or a comprehensive search that turns up bits and pieces of the mosaic in all sorts of unexpected places, even, as I said before, Australia and Oxford, far from here. Some of the best sources that have been available for me in studying Hoover have been the diaries and oral histories of people who know him. Because while Hoover did not, so far as we know, keep any systematic diary, or what we would call a diary, nevertheless, other people around him might keep diaries, and did, and some of those diaries are right here. And they would record the table talk or offhand observations or state of mind or whatever of Hoover when they might be in his presence. And so it's possible, when you think about it, when you're writing about somebody, you not only want to find out what that person is saying or putting on a printed page, but you're going to learn a lot from the people around him. And Hoover had a very loyal following and entourage of friends, and many of them, fortunately for history, did put some of their gleanings, as it were, down in print, so that we can learn a great deal of Hoover that way. Another technique that I used particularly in volumes 2 and 3 was to show Hoover in action, in battle as it were, as a kind of bureaucratic warrior dealing with the troubles of Belgian relief and managing the food administration. And so while we don't have a diary for Hoover, we do have correspondence going back and forth, and one begins to have a sense of the man at work, the man maneuvering, the public man, which I found valuable and tried to capture on the page, on the printed page, by showing just the ins and outs of this kind of argument that he had to engage in. The Belgian relief sounds in the abstract, very, very praiseworthy and noble and laudable, and indeed it was, but it was not easy. I don't have time to go into details, but there was much that was very rough and difficult and daunting about it. But by seeing Hoover dealing as he had to deal with the Germans and the Belgians sometimes and the British government and so on, you begin to get a composite picture of the man at work. And for Hoover, work was a large part of life. Now, one thing I learned along the way, trying to penetrate the barriers, as it were, trying to deal with the complexities of his personality, one thing I learned is that in research, you can never take what you read at face value. As I said a moment ago, biography writing is detective work, and biographers, like detectives, most often need to question their sources. As the British historian B.H. Littlehart said once upon a time, "Nothing can deceive like a document." I'll give you one humorous example of that. When I went to Australia in 1977, I was presented a copy of what was said to be a love poem that Herbert Hoover wrote to a barmaid in the Australian outback town of Kalgoorlie. Let me read a few verses of this, which has been widely attributed to Herbert Hoover. Do you ever dream, my sweetheart, of a twilight long ago, of a park in old Kalgoorlie where the bougainvilleas grow, where the moonbeams on the pathways trace a shimmering brocade, and the overhanging peppers form a lover's promenade? Stood we two a space in silence while the summer sun slipped down, and the gray dove dusk with drooping pinions wrapped the mining town. Then you raised your tender glances darkly, dreamily to mine, and my pulses clashed like cymbals in a rhapsody divine. Skipping on, I have fought my fight and triumphed. On the map I've writ my name. But I prize 1 hour of loving more than 50 years of fame. Well, this was a Herbert Hoover not known to previous scholarship. And my task, and really it was on my conscience, as it were, as a biographer, was I'm writing a definitive scholarly biography. That's my charge. Is this true? Did Herbert Hoover write this poem? Well, here's a copy of it from a book of Australian ballads. It's been sent to music. People over there down under in Australia told me, yes, Hoover must have written this, or he did write it. They just assumed it. So I had to do a fair amount of research to try to find out whether there was any authenticity to this. If you believe the words of the poem, he is writing this book, or this poem, as a famous man. You know, on the map I've written my name, which is to say he was presumably writing it in the 1920s or thereabouts, by which time he was a happily married man in the States with 2 grown sons and his eyes on the White House. So is a man apt to be writing a poem like this to a barmaid he hadn't seen since 1898? First question. Secondly, this talk of bougainvilleas in Kalgoorlie seemed dubious, since Kalgoorlie's in the desert. And they had a water shortage at the time that Hoover was there. The water pipeline that came in 350 miles from the Indian Ocean was not built until several years after Hoover left. So I doubt that there were many overhanging peppers to walk under and so forth. There are other things that made me highly skeptical of this. The poem was published while Hoover was alive in 1933 by an Australian journalist. And so far as I'm aware, Hoover never was aware of this attribution. But his reputation, which I gleaned from the recollections of people who knew him in the goldfields, is that he was a young man in his 20s, all business. He wasn't hanging around the local saloon flirting with the local barmaid. Nothing made sense. So my conclusion was that this was not an accurate story as far as Hoover was concerned. I do not know who wrote the poem, but it seems extremely unlikely that Hoover had anything to do with it. It's unlike anything we know he's ever written anywhere else. I've given you some of the reasons for discarding this as a hoax in all likelihood. My hunch is, I can't prove this, is if not the author, then somebody was circulating this around Australia and thought, well, it would be kind of amusing to give it the title Herbert Hoover's Love Song, because he was the least likely author. And if you think about it, suppose he did write it in the 1920s, how on earth did it get to Australia? You know, it just doesn't make sense. But I tell you this in a little bit of detail because it's illustrative of what biographers have to go through sometimes as we confront documents. This is a kind of a notorious case of a document that really is a hoax. But there are many, many other instances where one has to take the time to assess and weigh and determine probability and try to figure out who's writing what to whom and why. So again, biography writing, and this is my fundamental point, is not a mechanical exercise. Now, I don't want to leave you with the thought that because we are all speaking here of challenges of writing biography, that somehow biography writing is an unremitting struggle. That, I think, would be very unfair. I think I can truthfully say that we've all, those of us who have worked in one way or another on this Hoover biography project, have found it immensely enjoyable and rewarding and, we believe, significant work to do. And in the course along the way, one does develop insights. And in closing, I'm just going to quote a few brief remarks by Herbert Hoover, which I think helped me to understand his personality. He really had a gift for aphorism. We don't think of him that way, but he could make some very forceful and concise expressions that are rather memorable when you just read them on the page. Here's one. He said, I think he said this as president, he said, "My boyhood ambition was to be able to earn my own living without the help of anybody, anywhere." Think of that. He was an orphan. He didn't get along particularly well with the uncle who brought him up in Oregon for 6 years. And I think there was imbued in Hoover very early on by the circumstances of his boyhood a desire to achieve and to be independent. Here's another very revealing quotation which I think helps to unlock the mystery, if there is a mystery, so to speak, to Herbert Hoover. He said while he was in his 30s, quote, "If a man has not made a fortune by 40, he is not worth much." He said that while he was still in his 30s. Well, by the time he was approaching 40, he was probably worth $1 million in 1914 money. And around that time, he said to a friend, "Just making money isn't enough." He said he wanted to get into the big game somewhere. He wanted to get into the public eye in some way. He hadn't really quite worked it out at that point. So his attitude changed from doing well in the financial sense, making his mark on the world, becoming independent, being a monetary success, to doing good. But he wasn't quite sure how that would happen. World War I supplied the answer. Jumping ahead to 1920, he declared in 1920 that, in his words, "The American people are beginning to realize that words without action are the assassins of idealism." Words without action are the assassins of idealism. And I think that that is another key to Hoover's personality and makeup. He really was, in his way, an idealist, or as Ken Clements has said, a visionary. Many years later, in his declining years, he said several times to one of his grandchildren, and I heard it from the grandchild, he said, "When you stop wanting to know, then you start to die." I think that Herbert Hoover never stopped wanting to know and to achieve. He was very intense about this. It's a remarkable thing, and it led to a remarkable life of accomplishment. And it leads me to my final quotation from him, which I think is one of the most revealing of all. In an autobiographical statement that he wrote sometime during World War I, we believe, he said this, "There is little importance to men's lives except the accomplishments they leave to posterity. What a man accomplishes is of many categories and of many points of view. Moral influence, example, leadership in thought and inspiration are difficult to measure, and the proportion of success to be attributed to their effort is always indeterminate. In the origination or administration of tangible institutions or constructive works, men's parts can be more certainly defined. When all is said and done, accomplishment is all that counts." This, I think, is a key to his psyche. To Hoover, the institution builder, the man who created the Commission for Relief in Belgium, the head of the ARA, the Hoover Institution, and much more, a man who was driven to accomplish great things. This is the man who, long after his death, continues to fascinate a bevy of biographers, striving to understand his extraordinary imprint upon American history. It has been a challenge, yes, but the challenge has been well worth the effort. Thank you very much.